We need to talk about something. The current conflict in the Middle East has created a wave of controversy along several lines, and one of those is around the sensitive definition of who counts as native or indigenous to a land and who doesn't. On this, there's some things that Douglas Murray has said that have stirred the pot, to say the least. Now, do bear in mind that it's not necessarily an endorsement of what Douglas has said on this particular topic, but I mean to use his ideas as a jumping board into this touchy subject overall. Watch this exchange as he had on the Triggernometry podcast before we get into it.
This version is, of course, a replay of that version of American history, which is there with the Edenic first populations of America, the indigenous peoples, and then people from Europe came. The wicked Spanish and Italians and Portuguese and the French and even the British come and do their thing. And so they just put this version of history onto the Middle East. To those people, I would say, fine, you can do that if you want. Now let's do Britain. Want to play that game? You sure? You better not get the British started.
The first thing to recognize is that all of our conceptions of who is or who isn't indigenous breaks down when we zoom out into the larger time frame. That's because civilizations are in constant flux over time and have been for millennia. Now, I do think that the conflicts raging in the Middle East right now are very different to any other tussle over a geographic area, because the region happens to be significant for all three Abrahamic religions of the world who have claims over it. The question of who came here first is really just as elusive as the playground question of who started it. And in that case, if you put aside the religious aspect of the conflict, how long back can a group of people really go in claiming that it is theirs? The moment that you start playing that game, you've opened a can of worms that no one can really close, but perhaps that's where Douglas's analogy with modern-day Britain also starts to break down, because here's the difference. Immigration from what is collectively called the Global South to the Western world is not the same as what some may describe as a tug of war over a piece of religiously significant land. Immigration is a slow and controlled process of assimilation and osmosis that a country goes through with the outside world, and in the case of the UK and the United States, illegal immigration that attracts the world's best minds has been a major driver of economic and industrial growth. But if you scratch the surface, a seemingly harmless analogy you just saw can actually become fodder for the alt-right. Just how do you define an indigenous British without recourse to a person's race and then a slippery slide to racism? And if you go down the road, how do you square with the fact that second or third generation British immigrants usually count themselves as assimilated British citizens and have official citizenship? You realize very quickly that the idea of indigenous when it comes to immigration is a lot harder to define when it's a geopolitical tussle.
You want to play the indigenous people own the land first game and the other people should off? Well, it's 60 years of mass migration into the UK. Who are the indigenous peoples of the UK? People who've been here the longest. Who are the settlers? Who are the illegal settlers in Britain? Oh, well, that would be the people who've arrived. Does anyone want to go there?
The answer is no. No one really wants to go there, but historically speaking, there's another way that Britain is a much different subject for this debate than any other country. While Britain today may be hosting many immigrants from across the world, it's the British Empire across history that has been on the other side of this immigration, with one of the largest empires that have ever lived. It was said that the sun never set on the British Empire because any place the sun shined on Earth at any time, the British had settled somewhere near. So in the sense, while Douglas had a lot to come back against people playing the indigenous people game, it's also easy to push back against the same idea in the context of Britain's history. All in all, the entire game's just a bad one and not worth playing. And by the way, can you say the same about fiat money that is not backed by stable assets like precious metals? To get a stronger financial footing with the help of Birch Gold, click the link in the description or text the word FFIRA to 989898 to learn more. Now, if you look at some of what Douglas Murray has said in his books or social media, there's ideas that occasionally reveal a problematic strand, whether he intended to or not. For example, this tweet made by him quite a few rounds after Britain had their census, and it was revealed that the white British were now a minority in London. He said, and I quote, "I see many commentators on the census results saying, quote, so what if people who identify as white British are a minority in London, Birmingham, Leicester, Manchester, etc.? Just one answer to which is, because we never voted for this, quite the opposite in fact." Doesn't that sound like a tacit admission of what Douglas really thinks British is on a racial basis? Maybe you can say we're reading too much into it, and maybe so, but the truth is that including a race element in the conversation on immigration is always one step away from the racism of the alt-right. On this, there seems to be quite a contentious debate in the generally right-wing political circles of Britain because immigration and the definition of indigenous are very close to racist rhetoric, and it's always a delicate balancing act. British economist Paul Collier, who has shared this stage with Douglas Murray several times, found himself in a similar conundrum with journalist Mehdi Hassan when he made the mistake of throwing in a race element into an otherwise reasonable debate on immigration.
You repeatedly refer in the book, almost on every other page, to indigenous Britons or indigenous members of the population, which, as you know, has a certain resonance to some people on the far right. How do you define an indigenous Briton? What is an indigenous Briton?
Well, we've got to have some sort of concept for the non-immigrant population.
So what is it?
I mean, we might as well say indigenous for that.
In your book, you say that in the 2011 census, it was revealed that the indigenous British had become a minority in their own capital. The census showed that 63% of the population of London is born in Britain. The only way you can get a minority status is if you're white British. Then you're a minority in London,
okay,
but so British born. It's a phrase you've used in many interviews, many articles, in the Daily Mail, in the New Statesman.
Then you can look to the second generation. I mean, this is not...
No, I'm asking a simple question. Is that wrong?
That's not a spot you want to be in because it's hard enough to define who's indigenous and then much harder to do it on a racial basis in a globalized world. The whole notion of which racial group is indigenous to which land is not just dangerous and divisive, but also petty and narrow. We're all humans after all, living a few decades at best, identifying with a group collective to the extent that you are trying to trace your lineage or ownership of a land to centuries past is just a very small magnitude of thought. And then there's done on the basis of race, it's all the more petty because race is literally just a level of melanin in your skin, and it evolved in order to adapt to different heat or sunlight conditions in different parts of the planet. That's it.
Are Australians becoming too afraid to be proud of their own country?
Well, I think so. And I think it starts, as I said in the piece, from a very basic place. The same question that Americans, Canadians, and others have to ask themselves, which is, broadly speaking, are we glad that the people who found this country founded it? Or do we think they shouldn't have done? Do we think that Australian Aboriginal society ought to have been left as it was in perpetuity? Do we think that Columbus, when he sailed out and found the Americas, should have turned back home and said, nothing to see there, guys, no land of opportunity at all? Or broadly speaking, do we think that it's just that history happened?
Maybe it's true that history just happened and one powerful group took over the other, which has happened countless times in history, but something we can all take away is that the debate around whose race is indigenous and which race is foreign is a very tight rope to walk. Unfortunately, that's sometimes the flavor that the immigration debate can take on. When Douglas Murray points out the absurdity of this in the context of the Middle East, it would have made much more sense in the absence of some other things he said in the past that make it harder to put your weight completely behind him on this topic.